So I have been, previously I was a volunteer, a bedside caregiver for Zen Caregiving for 10 years. And I've been in my current position now for 6.5 years. Um, and it's our privilege and honor to offer these free sessions. We're a very small nonprofit, so please tell other people about us. Because this is how we spread the word of the work that we do. And please be aware that we have a chat function at the bottom. I see some of you have already used it, which is great. If you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. There will be time at the end of this session for questions and comments. And I will be probably soliciting feedback from you at some point during the course of this session today. So just as a way of framing the topic, you know, the idea of sitting with somebody at the end of life, especially a loved one, can be a very daunting prospect. It can be frightening, bring up feelings of inadequacy, uncertainty, but it's also an opportunity. The opportunity to be with somebody at the end of life is really a sacred and intimate time. And I really don't use that word sacred loosely. You know, accompanying someone in their last moments is a deep privilege and an incredibly intimate thing to do. And so the challenge for us as caregivers is, how do we make the best use of that opportunity? How do we stay present and fully open and aware to the situation that we're experiencing? And so this is really where presence and mindfulness comes in. Is mindfulness is a practice that allows us to be fully open to the experience that we're having and not getting too caught up in our mind and our projections, or even, you know, getting caught up in the emotions that may be overwhelming us. And one of the things that I'll talk about is the importance of embodiment, of being grounded, of being in our bodies, as opposed to being too caught up in our minds. So I thought that I would just ask, how many people here have a familiarity with mindfulness or mindfulness practices? You can just raise your hand. Okay, good. So it looks like a good proportion of you have at least some sort of working knowledge or familiarity with mindfulness. So, excuse me. So I wanted to start by just naming some of the challenges that can arise for us at the end of life when we're sitting with someone who is transitioning, or as we say, actively dying. And actively dying is a somewhat of a medical term, and I'll get into that later, but it's really the very last phase of the dying process. And it can last anywhere from you know, an hour or a few hours to maybe even a couple of days. So one of the biggest things I find that people find challenging is the uncertainty, is not knowing what's happening and not knowing what to do. So it's unfamiliar terrain. If you've not had experience around death and dying, of course, you're going to be a little bit lost. And it's that sense of loss of control that can be really unnerving for people, of that there's really nothing that we can do, a sense of helplessness. And we may want to do more, but we don't know what that more might even look like. We may be experiencing, a person in that moment may be experiencing grief. Grief, sometimes grief is thought of as something that arises after the death of someone close to us. I take a much broader view of grief. Grief is the heart's natural response to loss, any loss, which includes the loss of a relationship, a job, a home, and all of the many losses we may suffer throughout our lives. Disappointment can be a loss. But there's a certain kind of grief that occurs before the death of someone, and that is anticipatory grief, is that we may be grieving the fact that they are going to be gone very soon. And that's a very important thing to understand, because when someone close to us is terminally ill, we are already in a state of grief. We have already lost certain aspects of our relationship with them, and we're going to lose them completely at the end of this process. So there's the grief that we're feeling for what we've already lost, and there's the grief of anticipation, of expectation. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a very difficult thing to navigate. So how can we use mindfulness in this context? How can we use mindfulness to assist us to be more present, to be more grounded, to feel less at sea with this process? So mindfulness is simply this, the practice of maintaining our attention in the present moment with a sense of intention, and to do it without judgment. So paying attention to the present moment on purpose without any judgment. So that's sort of a simple working definition. I like to think of it as a practice of noticing. I sometimes frame it as listening. And when I say listening, I don't mean listening just with our ears, but listening with our whole being, listening with our senses, with our bodies, our energy, being attuned to what's happening in front of us. Mindfulness is the practice of being with things just as they are. And I think that what's significant about that is that so often there's something in our minds or in our hearts that resists things, we don't want something to happen. We don't want it to be the way that it is. And so we tend to push away, push back a certain aversion. And so we want to sit in an attitude. Mindfulness is not trying to change or manipulate the situation we find ourselves in, regardless of how unpleasant or scary it may feel. But really acknowledging that this is what's happening right now. And one of the ways we can do that, as I said, is to be embodied, is to feel our sense of being grounded in our body. And the relationship between mindfulness and meditation is obviously the techniques of mindfulness are applied when we sit in meditation. And they can be applied in our waking daily life in various ways. We can always be present in the moment. We can always pay attention to what's going on around us at any point in our daily lives. We may get busy, we may have a million things to do, we may get caught up here, but we always have that option to come back to the here and now, to feel our feet on the floor, for instance, to take a breath, to just be in that moment. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to do a short meditation just to get us settled and also to establish a feeling of mindfulness as we proceed through the rest of this session. So I invite you to find a comfortable posture. And keep in mind that meditation can be done in any posture. It can be done lying down if you have physical limitations, but most commonly people do it sitting up, sitting either in a chair or cross-legged on the floor and on a cushion. So please find a posture that is comfortable for you. And if it's safe for you to do so, if it feels okay, I invite you to close your eyes. If you would rather sit with your eyes open, that is an option, but you would want to allow your eyes to be downcast slightly, a few feet in front of you with a soft focus. So you're not really looking at anything. So either with the eyes closed or with the eyes downcast and a soft focus. And let's allow ourselves to just feel our bodies in this moment. And one thing we can pay attention to is the contact points of our body, where our body is held up by the floor, the ground, the earth, the chair, and gravity is holding us down. So there's these two forces, the weight of gravity holding us to the ground and the support of the earth, the floor, and the chair. And we might bring our attention, for instance, it's good to have your feet flat on the floor if you're sitting in a chair, and notice the light pressure of the soles of the feet on the floor. Or to feel your hands resting on your thighs or in your lap, the weight, the warmth of your hands. Or to feel the pressure of your butt or your sit bones on the cushion or chair. All the places we're supported, that our body is held up. And now bringing our attention to the breath. And the breath is a good anchor for our attention, for our meditation. It's something that can always be available to us to bring us into the present moment. If we pay attention to the breath is always happening in the here and now. Most people find it helpful to focus on the breath at one of 3 points, either the nostrils, the chest, or the belly. I invite you to choose one of those 3 points, whichever feels comfortable for you. If you choose the nostrils, you notice the sensation of the air brushing against the edge of the nostrils as you breathe in and out. And if you choose the chest or belly, noticing the gentle rising and falling with each breath. In this way, we give our mind, our busy minds, a point of focus. Place to rest. Inevitably, as we do this, our mind will wander and we may become distracted. And we may find ourselves lost in a train of thought, associations, stories. Whenever that happens, we have a choice. When we notice that we're distracted and lost in thought, we have a choice to bring our attention back to the breath, gently and without judgment. And so this is one of the most basic meditation techniques, to focus on our breath, and whenever distraction occurs, to gently return our attention to the breath. We may find we have to do this over and over again, as each time our mind distracts us with thoughts, images, stories, worries, planning. Always returning to the breath. The breath is always available to us. Again, intrusive thoughts, agitation in the mind, or restlessness is not a problem. It's a part of the meditation. We make everything in our experience a part of our meditation. Just noticing the state of our mind. Being curious about it, but always returning to the breath whenever possible. The reliable, constant presence of our cycle of breathing in and out. I want you now to try to bring your attention specifically to your exhale and to notice the quality of breathing out. That it often has a quality of relaxing or releasing, a letting go. When we exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and comes to rest. So allow yourself to tap into that sense of the exhale, letting go and fading into emptiness. Allow yourself, if you can, to rest in that moment, that pause at the end of the exhale. If only for a second. And when you hear the bell to end the meditation, I invite you to open your eyes slowly if they're closed and to re-enter the active world slowly and gently. Okay. Thank you for participating in that. And I just want to take a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions about the process of meditating. Okay. So using meditation to ground ourselves is a really effective way of getting into the right mind space to be present with difficult emotions or with someone who may be near the end of life. And what we teach our volunteers, how our volunteers work, is that we do a meeting at the beginning and end of each shift, and at each meeting we sit in meditation for 10 minutes. And it's a way for us to just collect ourselves and to ground into a sense of the present moment. And I wanted to move on now to some of the things that you can expect to see or notice, observe for somebody who is near the end of life. And there are some common features when people go through the dying process. Now, clearly, this depends on a number of factors, on age, type of disease or condition that someone may be dying from. But in most progressive illnesses, there are going to be certain recognizable stages that we can see. So one of the first ones, as somebody approaches the active dying process, is that they will stop eating. And this is entirely normal and natural. As people's bodies begin to weaken, the need for food, for fuel, is reduced, and the ability of the body to metabolize food is impaired. So oftentimes what happens near the end of life is people will stop eating and their loved ones will become very concerned. And they'll think that they have to do something to try to get them to eat. And I can't emphasize strongly enough how this can be harmful. People may be at risk of aspiration. It may just be that it's something that is very unpleasant for them. And so feeding people who have decided that they no longer want to eat can actually increase suffering and can be physically harmful in some ways. And we see this commonly, is that people want to feed their loved ones. They think that if they don't, that they're sort of giving up on them. But it's really important to understand this is a natural step in the progress of a disease. Sleeping more. You will often find that as people start to weaken and get closer to the end of life, they will sleep more and more. They may stop being responsive and speaking. Their eyes may still be open. They may even track or turn their heads, but they won't speak. Oftentimes, you will see people speaking to someone that is not there, is not there in our reality. We're not aware of another person, but they'll be having a conversation or speaking to someone we can't see. Just in general, becoming more what they say medically of being internally preoccupied. So their energy, their attention tends to turn inward. And so they're not so much paying attention to the outside world or their environment. They're sort of directed inward. And there may be good reasons for that. I don't think there's any good medical data, but as people go through the dying process, there are things that are happening internally, emotionally, mentally, as well as physically, that they may be processing things that we aren't really aware of. Another thing that can occur is a fixed gaze, is the eyes are open, but they're not tracking any longer, and they're just fixed on one point. Breathing through the mouth. Oftentimes, as people approach death, their mouth will hang open, and they will breathe through their mouth. At this point in the dying process, it can be really helpful to provide oral care. And there's a variety of ways to do that because the mouth can become very dry. The lips can become cracked. You can apply some kind of moisture or a Vaseline to the lips. They have these little sponge swabs that you can use. You can dip in water to clear out mucus and gunk in the mouth. Those are also good because the person can close their mouth and suck on the sponge and get a little bit of moisture that way. So keeping the mouth moist and clean can be a great physical thing to offer people who are at that point. Another thing that will happen with breathing, especially as people get very close to dying, is apnea breathing. And so someone will exhale, and there may be a 30, even 40-second pause after the end of that exhale before an inhale comes. And oftentimes it's a situation of wondering, wow, was that the last breath? And then suddenly they'll breathe in again. And so that's very common. The gaps between breaths can become longer and longer. Sometimes you'll hear a rattle in the breath, in the lungs. As the body weakens, the secretions of the lungs are no longer able to be expelled. Conventional medical wisdom is that this is not uncomfortable, even though it sounds like it's pretty bad. But most doctors will say that it's not a source of real distress or discomfort for the person. So those are just a few things that you can sort of stages and signs that you can take note of and know that this is a part of a natural process. It doesn't mean that something's wrong. And that's really, really important. I want to say a few words now about speech and touch. Again, conventionally, what people say is that hearing is the last sense to go. I used to wonder about that because I'd never seen any data to support it. But there actually does seem to be some pretty solid data now to support the fact that hearing remains active and the brain responds to speech, especially of loved ones, right up very close to the end of life. And the way that I have always felt about this is that regardless of whether somebody can hear you or not, there's no downside to talking to them, to telling them you love them, to saying goodbye, to telling them anything you want to say to them. Because if they can hear you, great. And if they can't, it's still, there's a benefit for us to express what we're feeling to this person. So there's no downside to talking to people at the end of life. Touch may also be active, and especially if this is someone that you've been physically close to, holding their hand, stroking their forehead or their arm. These are wonderful things to do. If it seems like it's a comfort to them, we can pay attention to the way people respond. If we touch them and we feel a kind of tensing up or a contraction, it may be that it's something that's not pleasurable for them, and we may take note of that and withdraw the touch. But if we touch someone and we can feel a sense of sort of relaxing or releasing, softening, that may be an indication that it is pleasurable to them, and that's something we can continue to do. So I mentioned staying embodied. Awareness of our physical body can be a very important skill to cultivate, especially when we're in an emotionally difficult situation, like somebody who's dying. And we teach our volunteers these three basic skills of sitting, breathing, and listening. So if you're at the bedside of someone who's close to the end of life, those three attributes, sitting, breathing, and listening, can be a great focus. We sit in a way that feels grounded. We notice our feet on our floor or our butt on the chair. We feel our sense of embodiment. We feel our body. We feel our breath. Listening, again, being attuned with all of our senses to whatever is going on for the person we're sitting with. And breathing is one of those things, and most people know this, that if you are in an emotionally difficult state, sometimes, very commonly, people will hold their breath, or their breathing will become shallow or tight. So awareness of the breath, keeping our breath smooth and regular, or just taking one nice deep breath, can be very helpful. So the body, feeling embodied, being in our body, is immensely important. What happens when we get into a difficult emotional state, whether it's fear, anxiety, sadness, some kind of suffering, the mind can become very active. And then you sort of have that sort of racing mind thing. But always returning to the body. And you can ask yourself these two questions. What am I feeling? And where am I feeling it? And you may notice, oh, I'm feeling this tension in my gut, or I'm feeling pressure in my chest, or I'm feeling tightness in my shoulders. We don't have to know the reason for it, but focusing on the physical body can be hugely helpful. So we have about 7 minutes left, and I feel like I've done a lot of talking, and I would like to give everybody an opportunity to share any comments, experiences, or questions that you may have. And keep in mind, sometimes we can be reluctant to ask a question uh, because we think that maybe it's not important enough. What I've found in leading groups over many years is that oftentimes when someone asks a question, somebody else in the group has the same question. And so in doing that, you're actually helping the entire group. So please, let's take a few moments, let's take a few minutes to just let me hear from you. And you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and start speaking. Yes, please, Alexis.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to or had any techniques or advice for that kind of end of life agitation where
Mm.
they're very uncomfortable and um, agitated and just physically uncomfortable.
Yeah, they call that terminal restlessness or terminal agitation. And it's not common, but it is, among a certain percentage of people, that's something that can occur. Medically, one of the only ways of dealing with that is really to sedate people. Short of that, there really is nothing you can do but try to just mitigate the restlessness by sort of moving with the person. So I spent an entire afternoon with a patient once, and she had terminal restlessness, and she would lie down, and she would do that for 20 seconds, and then she would sit up, and then she would want to get up. And because she couldn't walk, we would put her in a wheelchair, and then we would wheel her somewhere, and then she'd want to go back to bed, and it was just this back and forth all afternoon. And again, it was just me and her daughter, and all we did was we kind of facilitated this, because if you resist, then it's just going to create more anguish and distress. So I'm afraid that's really all I can offer for that, short of, like I said, some kind of medical intervention like sedation, medication. Yes, Lori.
I had a question. I'm a little bit familiar with your work, but I'm not sure I'm familiar with how your project maybe prepares families. Sometimes I find in end of life work that families and loved ones aren't prepared for these steps that you just outlined that we're familiar with. Do you try to have conversations prior, or do you talk about anticipatory grief prior? Are people receptive?
Well, in terms of family caregivers, is that people come to us often when they're already in the process of caring for an aging parent, for instance, or a loved one, and they may be at various stages of their own journey through caregiving. And one of the things that is the foundation of everything we do, our teaching and what we use for our volunteer program, is mindfulness, is to be fully present. And it's not necessarily an easy thing when you're talking about something as uncomfortable or frightening or painful as death. But really, the ground on which we build all of the other practices we use around death and dying really is mindfulness. You have to be fully open and aware to both what's happening with the person you're caring for, but also with ourselves. That's the really important part of this equation, is that it's not just mindfulness of what's going on in front of us, but what we're experiencing too. And that's where self-compassion is really important, because we're going to be suffering, and we may want to repress or push away that suffering, but really what we want to do is we want we want to acknowledge it, and we want to hold it with love and compassion, to recognize that what we're experiencing is really hard. It's really difficult. And we need to hold ourselves with love and kindness, because sometimes we judge ourselves about the various things that we can or can't do, that we should have done. And that applies to people no matter where they are in their caregiving journey. I'm not sure, does that help?
It does actually. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. I'm aware of the fact that in 45 minutes in a Zoom format that there's not a lot that we can give you, but I'm hoping that some of this is going to be helpful for you in some ways. Some of it may strike a chord of familiarity with your own experiences. And I do want to point out that we have a variety of education programs you can find on our website: Mindful Caregiver Education for family caregivers, and various other trainings and groups that we offer. So I want to give everybody an opportunity to share if you have anything you would like to share, because we're really just about at the end of our time here. Any questions or comments that you may have? Rich?
There was a question in the chat. I just wanted to
Oh, yes.
make
Oh,
aware
I'm
of.
sorry. I didn't see that. Oh my, yeah. Somebody are other people looking at this? Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so Stephanie, you have headphones on, so I assume you can hear me. I want to say first off that I'm glad you're with your husband and that he's sleeping. And wanting to be alone with him is perfectly natural. I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the number of people who may be having too many people there, it's really hard to say, because that depends on what that person's wishes may have been, or were they a very social person in life, or were they very private? And only you really know that. I would say that no, there's no limit to how many people can be with somebody at the end of life. I've seen, entire large families around the bedside, and I've seen people who were all alone except for a single volunteer. So there are no set rules for something like that. I think that as long as there aren't other people who are really close to your husband, like say a child or somebody like that, maybe a sibling, I think that you're perfectly justified in asking to be alone with him. But again, I don't know exactly your situation. Yeah, that's a tricky one. Okay, thanks for pointing that out, Rich. Okay, any other last comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
This is it's kind of personal, of course, like every experience is different. And I guess you have to cry, right? If you want to cry, but a lot of us are like, oh, and actually my friend just passed away, so it's kind of fresh, and I cried and it was very beautiful. And he looked at me so comforting, and so I wouldn't say not cry, but you don't want to upset the person too. But my experience, like it was very beautiful, and he accepted it, and he looked at me so kindly, because I knew he knew that I was upset, and it was okay. So it's good to get that out, but then sometimes you're like, oh, I don't want to cry, I might upset them more. But
Yeah, so it sounds like there's two things happening here. There's the emotion, and then there's the judgment about the emotion. And I personally believe that you can't go wrong with an honest expression of emotion. I mean, that's just natural. And so if that's what you're feeling, I don't see any real benefit in repressing that. So I'm sorry, I'm just looking at this latest chat.
I was just responding to Stephanie.
Yeah, no, I see that.
Same
Thank you.
situation.
So yeah, Chris, honest expressions of emotion. The only thing, the only caveat I would have about that is that if someone's dying and you're just completely breaking down and your energy is kind of taking over everything, I would say that might be difficult. Yeah, that might be difficult for someone who's dying. But to shed tears, to cry, I don't see a problem with that at all.
Yeah, and I asked kind of, well, in the end, I was like, gosh, he's hanging on so long, and he was holding my hand so tight for hours and hours. Like, so it hurt that he was holding my hand that tight. And at the end, finally, like day went by or whatever, too. And finally I said, Fred, I'm gonna be okay. And he passed like an hour later, like, I don't know from seeing me cry, I'm glad I cried. Like, I needed to cry. And it wasn't like I was hysterical for hours, but just that moment of sadness. And but then I thought about it later, and I don't regret crying or whatever, but it was very beautiful. But I wonder, like, maybe he thought, I'm not gonna leave because she's so upset.
There is that dynamic sometimes of the person, this danger, this worry that the person's going to hang on because we're holding them back. And I love that you told him that you were going to be okay. That's actually something that people will do commonly, is they'll say it's okay to go. There's also 5 things that this is kind of a standard thing that people can remember and do at the end of life, is to say these 5 things: is please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, goodbye. And so you're sort of wrapping up, but to give the person permission to say, you can go, it's okay, or I'm going to be okay, just as you said, gives that person permission to let go, to not feel like they have to be caught there with you.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. So we've gone over time, and I want to honor everybody's schedules and time. Thank you so much for joining us. Please check out our website and some of the many offerings we have. We have recorded meditations and guided meditations. We have a Tuesday morning live meditation on Zoom, live on Zoom. That's where we are now. Spread the word. Tell your anybody that you know who might be interested in our programs, what we do. And thank you again.